Hello and welcome to the course. My name is Bill Such and I'll be doing the intensive with you in the latter part of February. And by now, presumably I'll be finding out, I'm recording this on Friday of the first week, who's in the course and allocate the assignments based on the presentations that are in the syllabus. After the first week, you've got some reading done, so you've got some idea of what this course is about. Well, what I want to do now is just basically give you a synopsis, a large overview of where the course is going in respect to me, what I think about the main elements of it, and what I want to bring to you. And the first thing I'd like to say that I think is really quite exciting is that I'm not aware that this kind of work that I'll be explaining to you has been done before. And I'm saying that in two respects. One in respect to New Testament theology, because that's my area of expertise. And the other is in respect to what I call the organization of business cultures and how they relate to spiritual entities. If you put both together, in other words, the work that's out in the last 25 years in terms of the professional development of business cultures and culture in general as it relates to leadership, then you can see a growing expertise. But there's very little connection with the spiritual notion that we will be talking about in respect to the powers, the rulers and the authorities and how that relates to cultural transformation. On the other hand, in a theological vein, it's only been in the last 20 to 25 years that there's been a concerted scholarly look at the notion of the powers in the New Testament and how those powers relate to organizational structures, particular cultures, nations, tribes, mythologies that people hold, ideologies, beliefs, and so forth. Generally speaking, in New Testament theology, in the 19th century, the notion of the powers was largely dismissed as being a sort of an archaic worldview. And in the 20th century, it's gained more credence amongst scholars, but it's either gone in two camps. The two camps are as it relates to spiritual beings. In other words, the powers relates to good and evil spiritual beings that exist in the universe, in the heavenly places, however we interpret that. On a populist level, that's interpreted as above, i.e. in heaven. What that means in terms of the structure of reality is another question within itself. Or else they've been interpreted or reinterpreted, I want to use the word demythologized, reinterpreted in a new way so that it relates to political structures and economic and so forth, cultural structures that exist upon the earth. And what I'm exploring is the nature of both of those entities. In other words, the way that spiritual beings, or the unseen spiritual world that is comprised of good and evil beings, how that relates then to the world of socio-political reality, the culture that we deal with, the organizations that exist within that culture, and whether they have a spiritual element to them or whether they're purely, I'll use today's current word in the modern and postmodern environment, which is neutral. In other words, they're neutral, or if they're not neutral, they are expected to be interpreted as neutral, and therefore elements that grow out of that are such things as tolerance for all points of view culturally, and notions whereby the neutrality ensures that no one ideology gets presented over another, because all the ideologies are social constructions of reality, and these structures are valid within themselves, as opposed to there being an overall unifying element within the culture that determines how these structures should exist. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the way that we understand organizations within culture from, I might say, a Christian standpoint as opposed to a non-Christian or a secular standpoint. As a Christian standpoint, as we look at these organizations, or in the way that I'm talking to you, these organizations that also have spiritual roots. We'll explore this much further in respect to whether the spiritual roots are endemic to the organization within itself. So in other words, the spiritual roots are part of the, I'll use one of the scholars, Walter Wink's terminology, the interiority of the organization within itself, or whether they are actually spiritual beings that have their hands, so to speak, their minds, think of C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, entwined within these physical, socio-economic realities. So there's an element of both that's involved there that we will be exploring. This is important because we're talking about strategies that we will use as leaders in the church. And the church, the notion of the church is very, very important, as we shall see, in terms of how we are to bring about cultural engagement that will lead to the transformation that we have understood and exhibited in our own lives, in our own churches, and that comes from what Jesus Christ has done on the cross in being raised from the dead and given us the forgiveness of sins and the reality of eternal life in promise of what is to come in part now as we seek to live that life. We'll be looking at cultural change. In other words, as leaders, as we look into the transformation of culture, how can we do that in ways that, and this is my primary emphasis that I'll be exploring, and this is what I think is new, not in what I call the privatization of religion and culture. In other words, it's me and my beliefs and my church's belief, and then we look out to change the culture around us, which invariably comes down to evangelism, which is, if we become evangelists, then we sort of bring people out of the kingdom of darkness, spiritual realities that are evil, into the kingdom of Jesus Christ, in God's kingdom in Jesus Christ. And therefore, from that standpoint, it's done one person at a time. I have no trouble with that. I accept that. The question then comes in, and then how do you deal with other realities apart from that in terms of transformation? Or is that your major emphasis of transformation? Beginning with the notion of the gospel, which has transformed everything for us, I believe that we can engage in cultural transformation, if I can use those terms, in respect to not simply the conversion of individuals, but the notion of actually changing organizations around us, or, to make it more specific, social problems that we face in the culture around us, in such a way that it can have an impact in respect to, yes, people becoming Christians, but yes, good, i.e. the transformation of what Christ has done for our culture in such a way that it extends through that culture in itself, because ultimately whatever is in the culture has got some origin in the person of Jesus as the Word of God. Think of John chapter 1 verses 1 through 10 there, where the notion of that all that is created was created through the Word. Verse 14, that Word became flesh. That Word is the Son of God. We're talking about Jesus. So in some sense then, if what I'm saying is true, and I've got to establish all this with you and then demonstrate how that can be used to impact culture in respect to leadership. If that's true, it means then that in some of what you might call the worst cultures that you can imagine, whether it's Hitler's Nazi Germany in the 1930s, National Socialism, whether it's Iraq under Saddam Hussein, or whether it's a particular culture, like a car body culture, GMC, or a nation, that in some sense whatever is there because of the foundation that was established when Jesus was instrumental in creating everything. So that culture in itself is a testimony in some way to who Jesus is, and that there are elements of Jesus within that particular culture, no matter how insidious we might find it. Now, the rationale that I'm going to give you, before I conclude, when I was thinking about it, how could I put this in a more sort of simple form, is the idea of Paul going into Athens in Acts 17. When he goes into Athens, and instead of separating himself from the Athenians and then saying, I bring you a new system of reality, so to speak, that's embodied in this person, Jesus. What he does is he looks around and he sees this statue to an unknown God, culture, in other words, their culture, that they already have within them the seeds of a godly culture, in a sense, because they have, for whatever reason, put aside this statue to an unknown God. And Paul says, I want to be able to tell you now about that God. Of course, what he does is he talks about God in such a way that he then seeks to expand his and their ideas, which makes all the other gods, so to speak, in their culture to be irrelevant, because God, so to speak, swallows them all up. All right. Now, I just want to use that as an analogy to say, I want to approach leadership from that standpoint of being embedded within the culture that's foreign to us. In other words, the social problems that we want to change, the culture that's around about us, but that we use elements of that culture because we recognize that Jesus is somehow found in that culture, because there are foundation points through which he created himself. And then, of course, the other big thing is that the nature of Christ's death, in which the new humanity is started, embodied in the church, is something that is ultimately to lead to everything, the transformation of all culture. And so our engagement in leadership, in transforming culture, is also an evidence, if I can use the word evangelistic, is evidence then of what Jesus Christ has done in respect to the empowerment that's been brought about through his death, burial and resurrection. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a transformation of culture around us. More specifically, we're talking about problems that exist within that environment. For me, it's homelessness. It could be drug addiction. It could be the operation of the media, depending upon where you are. All the social problems, can they be addressed? And should they be addressed by us as we go forward as a church into the 21st century, seeking to transform those around us? An assumption of this course is that that is the case. And if I have to establish that, I'll seek to do that. What I'm looking at is a methodology of cultural transformation through learning strategies from biblical strategies from which we can approach leadership in a way that will impact not simply the group of believers around us, but also the culture that that group is embedded in. I'm looking forward to this. I'll be in touch.